The air was thick with the tang of impending rain, clouds hovering low over the bustling city streets. Alexander Drake, CEO of the world-renowned tech company Dracotech, leaned back in the leather seat of his limousine. The world outside blurred into a wash of grey and movement as the car glided through the city's crowded avenues. For Alexander, this was another routine day packed with high-stakes meetings, relentless deadlines, and the unrelenting pressure of maintaining his empire. Despite his towering achievements, Alexander felt a nagging hollowness that no amount of zeros in his bank account could fill. He swiped at his phone absent-mindedly, scanning through emails and investment updates, but his thoughts drifted aimlessly. The clamor of the outside world faded as he pondered a question that had been haunting him for years. What's the point of all this, if I have no one to share it with? His driver, Neil, slowed the car as traffic thickened near the entrance of a farmer's market. The vibrant colors of fresh produce and the chatter of street vendors caught Alexander's attention. He glanced out the tinted window, something rare stirring in him. His life had been one of stark efficiency, every moment calculated, every interaction transactional. But this scene, so simple and grounded, felt like a glimpse into a world he had forgotten existed. A modest strawberry stand near the corner snagged his focus. The woman behind it, though plainly dressed in a faded floral shirt and worn jeans, radiated a kind of warmth that stood out amidst the city's frenetic energy. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his for a split second, and Alexander felt an inexplicable pull. "Neil," Alexander said abruptly, sitting forward. "Stop the car." "Sir?" Neil asked, glancing into the rearview mirror with mild confusion. "Just pull over," Alexander insisted. The car came to a halt at the curb, and before Neil could ask further questions, Alexander stepped out into the damp air. A few passers-by did a double-take, recognizing the billionaire's sharp, unmistakable features. Oblivious to the attention, Alexander strode toward the strawberry stand with a confidence that only slightly masked his curiosity. The woman behind the stall looked up as he approached, her brows knitting together in mild suspicion. She was younger than he'd initially thought, her features delicate but tinged with an edge of resilience. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and though her clothes were simple, they couldn't hide the undeniable grace in her movements. "Good afternoon," Alexander said, his deep voice steady but warmer than usual. "I'll take a carton of your strawberries." The woman hesitated, as if trying to determine whether he was a genuine customer or someone with ulterior motives. Finally, she nodded and handed him a carton. "That'll be $5, she said, her voice soft but firm. Alexander reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $50 bill. "Keep the change." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he thought she might refuse him altogether. "I don't take handouts," she said bluntly, holding out her hand for the exact amount. A flicker of amusement crossed Alexander's face. "It's not a handout. It's for the strawberries and the service." Her expression didn't soften. "I don't need your charity," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. "Do you want the strawberries or not?" Something about her defiance struck a chord in him. He rarely encountered people who challenged him, let alone someone as unassuming as this strawberry vendor. With a faint smile, he pulled out a $5 bill and placed it in her hand. "Thank you," she said curtly, returning to rearranging the cartons on her stand. "What's your name?" Alexander asked, unwilling to leave just yet. The woman hesitated, glancing at him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Sophie." "Sophie," he repeated, savoring the simplicity of her name. "I'm Alexander." She gave a non-committal nod, clearly uninterested in whatever he thought his name might mean to her. He couldn't remember the last time someone had treated him with such indifference. Before he could say more, a small voice interrupted. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Alexander turned to see a little boy, no older than 6, tugging at Sophie's sleeve. His dark curls framed a face that was strikingly similar to hers, and his big brown eyes sparkled with innocence. "Just a little longer, Danny," Sophie said gently, kneeling down to adjust the scarf around the boy's neck. "We'll go home soon." Alexander's gaze softened as he watched the interaction. It didn't take much to piece together the picture. Sophie was a single mother, working tirelessly to provide for her child. The thought stirred something unfamiliar in him, a mixture of admiration and something deeper he couldn't quite name. Danny's eyes flicked to Alexander, curiosity evident in his expression. "Who's he, Mummy?" "No one," Sophie said quickly, standing up and brushing her hands on her jeans. "Just a customer." Alexander couldn't suppress a small smile at her response. He crouched slightly to meet Danny's eye level. "I'm Alexander. Nice to meet you, Danny." Danny looked up at his mother for approval before offering a shy wave. "Hi. Do you like strawberries?" Alexander asked, gesturing to the cartons on the stand. Danny nodded enthusiastically. "They're my favorite." "Well then," Alexander said, straightening up and turning to Sophie. "You must have the best strawberries in town." Sophie rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the faint blush that crept up her cheeks. "Is there something else you need? Or are you just here to make small talk?" "Maybe I'm just here for the strawberries," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. Before Sophie could respond, a sudden gust of wind blew through the market, sending a few empty cartons tumbling to the ground. Sophie bent down to retrieve them, and Alexander instinctively moved to help. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same carton, and Sophie pulled back quickly, her cheeks reddening. "Thanks," she muttered, avoiding his gaze. Alexander stood, holding the carton out to her. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Sophie froze, her eyes snapping up to meet his. For a moment, there was something raw and vulnerable in her expression, but she quickly masked it with a defensive edge. "I've been doing it alone for years. I don't need help." "I didn't say you needed it," Alexander said softly, "but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." The words hung between them, charged with a meaning neither of them fully understood. Sophie looked away, busying herself with rearranging the stall, and Alexander knew better than to push her further. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Sophie sighed and started covering the strawberries with a plastic sheet. "You should go," she said, her tone dismissive. "It's going to pour soon." Alexander hesitated, reluctant to leave, but he knew she wouldn't welcome any further insistence. "I'll see you around, Sophie," he said finally, turning to walk away. She didn't respond, but as he glanced back over his shoulder, he caught her watching him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. He couldn't explain why, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Back in his limousine, Alexander stared at the carton of strawberries in his lap. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something beyond the monotony of his high-powered life. Sophie and her son had stirred something in him, a curiosity, a longing, a need to understand the kind of resilience and love that had kept them going despite the odds. As the rain began to pelt against the car windows, Alexander made a silent vow. He didn't know where this newfound connection would lead, but he was determined to find out. The following morning, Alexander Drake sat at his desk in the corner office of Draco Tech's sleek headquarters, his mind straying far from the towering stacks of reports in front of him. His workspace, a masterpiece of modern minimalism, offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. Usually the sight filled him with pride and a sense of accomplishment. Today it felt hollow. So all he could think about was Sophie, and the small strawberry stand tucked into the corner of the market. He hadn't meant to walk into her life with such force, but there was something about her, something magnetic, raw, and utterly captivating. She wasn't like the people he surrounded himself with at charity galas and corporate mixers. She was real, grounded in a way that made him feel untethered. And that little boy, Danny, with his bright eyes and innocent curiosity, had stirred a part of him he didn't even know existed. The buzz of his intercom interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Drake, you have a meeting with the finance team in 15 minutes, his assistant Lauren reminded him. "Reschedule it," he said absently, his gaze fixed on the clouds drifting outside the window. "Sir?" Lauren's voice carried a note of surprise. Alexander never missed meetings. "Just push it to later," he said, leaning back in his chair. After ending the call, he grabbed his phone and stared at the screen for a moment before dialing a number. Neil, his driver, answered on the second ring. "Yes, Mr. Drake?" "Pick me up in 10 minutes, Alexander said, already standing to grab his coat. "I'm going to the market." By the time Alexander arrived at the farmer's market, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the bustling scene. He walked with purpose, drawing curious glances as his tailored suit and commanding presence stood out against the casual crowd, but he didn't care. His eyes scanned the stalls until they landed on Sophie's familiar setup. She was there, as he'd hoped, her hands deftly arranging cartons of strawberries into neat rows. Danny sat on a small stool nearby, scribbling in a coloring book. Alexander couldn't help but smile at the sight. "Back again." Sophie's voice was tinged with suspicion as he approached. She straightened, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Good morning," Alexander said, his tone warm but reserved. "I couldn't resist. Your strawberries were the best I've ever had." Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Flattery won't get you a discount." Alexander chuckled, appreciating her sharp wit. "I'm not here for a discount. I'm here for more strawberries, and maybe a conversation if you're willing." Sophie hesitated, her gaze flicking to Danny, who was now watching Alexander with wide eyes. "You're persistent," she said finally, crossing her arms. "When something's worth it, persistence is the least I can offer," he replied, meeting her eyes. She seemed taken aback by his sincerity, but before she could respond, Danny spoke up. "Are you a businessman?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the tension. Alexander crouched down to Danny's level, a genuine smile softening his features. "I am. I help build things, companies mostly. What about you? What do you want to be when you grow up?" Danny's face lit up. "A firefighter, so I can save people." "That's a noble goal," Alexander said, nodding. "You'll be a hero." Danny beamed, and Sophie's expression softened as she watched the exchange. Alexander stood, sensing an opening. "How about this?" he said, looking at Sophie. "I buy all your strawberries today, and in exchange you have lunch with me." She blinked, clearly startled. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his tone light but serious. "Lunch, my treat, no strings attached." Sophie opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. She glanced at Danny, who was now looking up at her with an expression of hopeful curiosity. "Fine," she said finally, her tone reluctant. "But just lunch." "Perfect," Alexander said, a small, victorious smile tugging at his lips. "Pack up the strawberries. I'll wait." An hour later, they sat at a cozy cafe a few blocks from the market. Sophie had insisted on bringing Danny along, which Alexander welcomed. He found himself charmed by the boy's boundless energy and unfiltered honesty. As they ate, Alexander steered the conversation towards Sophie's life, careful not to push too hard. He learned that she'd grown up in a small town in Wisconsin, the youngest of 3 siblings. Her father had passed away when she was a teenager, and her mother had struggled to keep the family afloat. Sophie had moved to the city with big dreams of becoming a pastry chef, but life had taken an unexpected turn when she discovered she was pregnant with Danny. "What happened to Danny's father?" Alexander asked gently, sensing the weight of the topic. Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "He left when I told him I was pregnant," she said quietly. "Said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility." Alexander's jaw tightened. He couldn't fathom abandoning someone like Sophie, let alone a child as bright and full of life as Danny. "That must have been hard," he said, his voice low. "It was," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the table. "But I had Danny, and that made it worth it." The raw honesty in her words hit Alexander harder than he expected. He'd spent years surrounded by people who wore masks, who said what they thought he wanted to hear. Sophie's vulnerability was both refreshing and humbling. "And what about you?" Sophie asked, shifting the focus to him. "You seem like the kind of guy who has it all. Why are you spending your time at a farmer's market?" Alexander smiled faintly, his gaze thoughtful. "I do have a lot," he said, "but sometimes it feels like all the success in the world doesn't mean much if there's no one to share it with." Sophie studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "That's surprisingly honest." "I guess you bring that out in me," he said, meeting her gaze. For a moment the world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them locked in an unspoken understanding. But the moment was broken when Danny tugged at Sophie's sleeve, asking for another slice of cake. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander found himself reluctant to say goodbye. When they returned to the market, he helped Sophie set up her stall again, earning curious looks from other vendors. "You didn't have to do all this," Sophie said, as he handed her a crate of strawberries. "I wanted to," he replied simply. Sophie hesitated, then said, "Thank you. For lunch. And for everything." Alexander smiled. "It was my pleasure." As he turned to leave, Danny ran up and hugged his leg. "Bye, Mr. Alexander." The gesture caught him off guard, but he crouched down and ruffled the boy's hair. "Take care, Danny. And don't forget, you're going to be a hero someday." Danny grinned, and Alexander straightened, his gaze lingering on Sophie for a moment longer. "I'll see you around," he said. Sophie nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Maybe." As Alexander walked away, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander found himself returning to the market almost every morning. At first, Sophie treated him with guarded politeness, unsure of his intentions. But as the days passed, her walls began to crumble, slowly, piece by piece. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, and Alexander found himself looking forward to these moments more than he cared to admit. Sophie, meanwhile, found herself in uncharted territory. She wasn't used to someone like Alexander, someone who seemed to genuinely care, who listened without judgment and looked at her as if she mattered. She couldn't deny the way her heart raced when he smiled at her, or how her stomach fluttered when he spoke to Danny with such tenderness. Still, doubt lingered. Why would a man like him, wealthy, successful, powerful, care about someone like me? One morning, as Alexander approached the stall, he noticed Sophie struggling to unload a heavy crate from her small van. Danny was busy chasing a butterfly nearby, oblivious to his mother's efforts. "Let me help," Alexander said, stepping in before Sophie could protest. "I've got it," she insisted, her voice tense. "You don't have to do everything on your own, you know," he replied, effortlessly lifting the crate and placing it on the counter. Sophie sighed, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I'm used to it," she admitted. "That doesn't mean you should have to be," Alexander said softly, meeting her gaze. For a moment their eyes locked, and Sophie felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. She quickly looked away, busying herself with arranging the strawberries. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of frustration. "You could buy strawberries anywhere, or have someone deliver them to your door." Alexander hesitated, considering his words carefully. "Because it's not about the strawberries," he said finally. Sophie froze, her hands stilling over the carton she was arranging. "Then what is it about?" "You," he said simply. The honesty in his voice left her momentarily speechless. She wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off, but the sincerity in his expression made it impossible. Before she could respond, Danny ran up, holding the butterfly he'd been chasing in his small hands. "Look, Mommy, it's so pretty." Sophie smiled, grateful for the distraction. "Be gentle, sweetheart. You don't want to hurt it." Danny nodded and carefully released the butterfly, watching in awe as it fluttered away. Alexander crouched down beside him, his voice gentle. "That was kind of you, Danny, letting it go." Danny beamed. "Mommy says we should always be kind. She's a smart lady," Alexander said, glancing up at Sophie, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of warmth and unease. As the weeks went on, Alexander's presence at the market became a regular occurrence. The other vendors began to notice, some even teasing Sophie about her mystery man. She brushed off their comments with forced laughter, but deep down she couldn't deny the growing connection between her and Alexander. One crisp autumn morning, Alexander arrived at the stall earlier than usual. Sophie was surprised to see him holding a thermos and a small bag. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing the items suspiciously. "Breakfast," he said with a grin. "I figured you could use a warm drink and something to eat." Sophie hesitated, her instincts telling her to refuse, but the aroma of freshly brewed coffee was too tempting to resist. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting the thermos. Danny peeked into the bag and pulled out a croissant, his face lighting up. "Yum," Alexander chuckled. "I hope I got the order right. Chocolate-filled, right?" Danny nodded enthusiastically, already taking a big bite. As Sophie sipped the coffee, she felt a warmth spread through her, not just from the drink, but from the simple, thoughtful gesture. It was these small acts of kindness that made it harder for her to keep her guard up. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," Alexander replied, "but I want to." That afternoon, as Sophie packed up her stall, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his expression smug and confident. Sophie's heart sank as she recognized him. Elliot, Danny's father. "What are you doing here?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp. Elliot smirked, ignoring her question as his eyes scanned the stall. "Still selling strawberries, huh? I guess some things never change." Sophie's fists clenched at her sides. "What do you want, Elliot?" "I want to see my son," he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "I've had 6 years to see him," Sophie shot back. "Why now?" Before Elliot could respond, Alexander appeared, his presence commanding as he stepped between them. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Elliot sized him up, clearly unimpressed. "Who's this, your new boyfriend?" That's none of your business, Sophie said, her voice trembling with anger. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You heard her, he said, his tone icy. It's none of your business. Elliot sneered, but before he could say anything else, Danny ran up, clutching a drawing he'd been working on. Mommy, look what I made. Elliot's expression shifted as he looked at the boy. Hey, kiddo, remember me? Danny looked up at him, confusion clouding his features. No, he said bluntly, turning back to Sophie. Sophie's heart ached at the encounter, but she felt a flicker of pride at Danny's honesty. Elliot's smirk faltered, and he glanced at Sophie. We'll talk later, he said before getting back into his car and driving away. Alexander turned to Sophie, his expression filled with concern. Are you okay? She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. I'm fine. He just likes to show up when it's convenient for him. You don't have to deal with him alone, Alexander said gently. Sophie looked at him, her defenses crumbling. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice breaking. Because I care about you, he said simply. That evening, as Sophie tucked Danny into bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Alexander's words. No one had ever cared about her the way he did, not since her father. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of her past made it hard to trust. Meanwhile, Alexander sat in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the glittering city skyline. For the first time in years, he felt like he had something to fight for, someone to fight for. He didn't know what the future held, but he was willing to do whatever it took to earn Sophie's trust and build a life with her and Danny. The crisp morning air carried the scent of autumn as Sophie set up her stall at the market. The golden leaves swirling in the breeze mirrored the swirl of emotions she'd been grappling with. Alexander's unwavering kindness and support had begun to chip away at the walls she'd so carefully constructed over the years. Yet, doubts lingered. Could she truly allow herself to trust someone again? Would Alexander still want to be part of her world once he saw how complicated her life really was? Her thoughts were interrupted by Danny's excited voice. Mommy! Mr. Alexander's here! Sophie turned to see Alexander approaching, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers in one hand and a small bag in the other. His presence had become as familiar as the market itself, and she felt her heart skip a beat as he smiled at her. Good morning, Alexander said, handing her the sunflowers. For me? Sophie asked, her cheeks flushing. For you, he said softly. I thought they might brighten your day. Sophie accepted the flowers, her fingers brushing against his. Thank you. They're beautiful. Danny peeked into the bag Alexander was holding. What's in there? Alexander crouched down, revealing a box of pastries. Breakfast for my favorite market duo. Danny grinned, grabbing a croissant. Sophie couldn't help but smile at their interaction. Alexander had a way of making Danny feel special, and that alone melted a part of her she hadn't realized was frozen. As the day unfolded, Alexander stayed by Sophie's side, helping her with the stall and chatting with customers. For the first time in years, Sophie felt a sense of partnership, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to dream of since Danny was born. But just as the morning's warmth began to ease her worries, an unwelcome shadow fell over the market. Elliot. He strode toward the stall with the same smug confidence as before, his tailored suit and expensive watch screaming of wealth. Sophie tensed immediately, her grip tightening on the edge of the counter. What are you doing here again, Elliot? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. I told you, Sophie, I want to see my son, Elliot said, his tone dripping with feigned sincerity. Danny clutched Sophie's hand, his small fingers trembling. Mommy, I don't like him, he whispered. Alexander stepped forward, positioning himself between Sophie and Elliot. I think you've overstayed your welcome, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he sized Alexander up. And who are you? Her bodyguard. No, Alexander said, meeting Elliot's gaze without flinching. I'm someone who actually cares about Sophie and Danny. Something you clearly don't understand. Elliot scoffed, his mask of charm slipping to reveal the arrogance beneath. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, Alexander said, his tone steady. Because I won't let you hurt them. Elliot glared at Alexander for a long moment, before turning his attention back to Sophie. You think this guy can protect you? He doesn't know anything about you, or the mess you've made of your life. Sophie's chest tightened, shame threatening to creep in, but Alexander spoke before she could. You're right, Alexander said, his voice cold. I don't know everything about Sophie's past, but what I do know is that she's an incredible woman who's done everything she can to raise an amazing son, and that's more than you'll ever be able to say about yourself. Elliot's face darkened, but before he could retort, Sophie stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. You don't get to waltz in here and try to tear me down, Elliot. You left, you made your choice, and I've spent the last 6 years picking up the pieces. So if you really want to help, the best thing you can do is stay out of our lives. For the first time, Elliot seemed at a loss for words. He glanced between Sophie and Alexander, his jaw tightening before he finally turned and walked away. Sophie exhaled shakily, her knees threatening to give out. Alexander placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? She nodded, though tears brimmed in her eyes. Thank you, she said softly, for standing up for me. Always, Alexander said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander walked Sophie and Danny home. Their small apartment was modest but warm, filled with little touches that spoke of Sophie's love and care. A colourful quilt on the couch, Danny's drawings taped to the walls, the scent of fresh lavender wafting from a candle on the kitchen counter. Danny ran to his room, chattering excitedly about the butterfly he'd seen at the market. Sophie turned to Alexander, her expression uncertain. You didn't have to walk us home, she said. I wanted to, he replied, his gaze steady. They stood in the small living room, the silence between them charged with unspoken emotions. Sophie hesitated, then said, Why are you doing all this? Why do you care so much? Alexander stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. Because you matter to me, Sophie. You and Danny both. I've spent my whole life chasing success, but none of it has ever felt as important as this, as important as you. Tears spilled down Sophie's cheeks, and she looked away, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. I'm scared, she admitted. I've been hurt before. I don't know if I can do this. Alexander gently cupped her face, tilting her chin so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. I know it's not easy to trust, but I'm not going anywhere. I'll prove to you every day that I'm here for the long haul. Sophie searched his face, looking for any trace of insincerity, but all she saw was honesty and tenderness. Slowly, she nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. Okay, she whispered. Alexander leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she wasn't alone, that maybe, just maybe, she could let herself hope again. Months passed, and the bond between Alexander, Sophie, and Danny grew stronger. Alexander became a constant presence in their lives, attending Danny's school events, helping Sophie with the stall, and creating memories that filled their small apartment with laughter and love. One crisp winter evening, as they decorated a small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room, Alexander pulled Sophie aside. There's something I want to ask you, he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. Sophie tilted her head, her brow furrowing in curiosity. What is it? Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophie's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. I know your life hasn't been easy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I know trusting someone again is a leap of faith. But I love you, Sophie. I love Danny. And I want us to be a family. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she stared at him, her heart bursting with a mix of joy and disbelief. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, I'll marry you. Danny ran over, his eyes wide with excitement. Are we getting a new daddy? Sophie laughed through her tears, pulling him into a hug. Yes, sweetheart, we are. Alexander scooped them both into his arms, holding them close as the Christmas lights twinkled around them. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she was home, truly, completely home.